Okay, welcome to today's town hall debate, a supply chain disruption in crisis. 2 weeks ago, I wrote an editorial for Global SMT in Packaging October issue. I've updated that editorial and I'd like to use it as a bit of a monologue to start this debate today. What started as an underestimation of chip demand by the auto and consumer industries during COVID-19 pandemic has turned into a full-blown crisis. The shortfall in chips is expected to be made up by the end of the year, but it'll take the remainder of 2022 to filter through the supply chain. COVID can't take all the blame for the current disruption. The stockpiling by OEMs and EMS companies in 2019 is largely to blame for the shortage in capacitors, resistors, and other components, which are in growing demand, especially in the 5G and EV industries. Over 80% of these devices are manufactured in Asia. And rather worryingly, it appears these manufacturers are satisfying their Asian clients first, ahead of demand in Europe and North America. At the heart of the component supply issue is a shortage of raw materials, notably palladium, nickel, some rare earth metals, and indium, for example. Added to these disruptions, the COVID 19 pandemic has upset the balance of trade shipping across the world. There are fewer passenger aircraft flying from Asia to Europe and the USA, which traditionally carried many of the components used in the EMS assembly industry in the bellies of these aircraft. Distributors and manufacturers then turn to seaborne shipping, but there's a shortage of ships to meet the demand. It takes 2 years to build a new ship. Compounding this problem is a lack of labour at many of the ports, resulting recently in over 60 ships being moored off the port of Los Angeles, unable to offload their cargo. This, along with the recent Suez Canal blockage, has caused a global shortage of shipping containers. If ships are backed up at Western ports, then dockers in Asia cannot find enough containers to load fresh cargo. This supply and demand disparity has resulted in shipping costs rising sixfold over the past 12 months from Asia to Europe and tenfold from Asia to the United States. These rising prices have proliferated across the entire supply chain. So, what is the end game? Some are predicting these rises will result in a market softening. Opinions range from as early as Q4 this year to as late as Q2 2022. If this does happen, it will create a welcome respite to allow the supply chain to reset. Assuming countries increase the percentage of their vaccinated population, there are no vaccine resistant variants emerging, and there's no geopolitical instability from China and Taiwan or the Korean Peninsula, for example. The fragility of the global supply chain makes it increasingly clear that regional capacity is now a must have for both Europe and North America. Governments need to move with some urgency to create the conditions for semiconductor manufacturing in Eastern Europe and southern Mexico. Interestingly, as we go to press, the US administration has called for an emergency summit on the semiconductor crisis, which I actually think is going on today. So that was my monologue on this topic. I'm joined by a distinguished panel today. I have Ed Bexey from Pegmatis joining us, Richard Boyle from Henkel Corporation, and Matt Holtzman from CGI Americas. So, welcome, gentlemen. Nice to see you today, and thank you for taking the time to take part in this debate. I should say before we get
Morning.
started, we actually were trying to get some of the larger CEMs to take part in this debate, but of course nobody wants to admit to having a shortage of materials. Um, so let's start by going around the table and just getting very quickly tell us a little bit about your company and how it's affecting you at the moment. Let's start with Ed.
Good morning or afternoon, Trevor. Thank you. My name is Ed Bexey. I'm the president and CEO of Pegmatis. We are a design and development company, so we are quite impacted by this global supply chain through our clients.
Right. Well, I'm sure you are. I mean, it's one of the issues that I think a lot of people are having is they can't find components, so they're pushing back on people like you to redesign, essentially to redesign the boards. Um, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later on, and how you go about that. Richard, what are you finding is happening in the materials side?
I think we're actually quite fortunate in the way that the company is set up. We've got a very good relationship with a lot of our suppliers, and we support them and have worked with them for a very long time. We also are developing more and more of what we call a circular economy approach to our raw materials. So we're liaising, we're working with a number of companies to use our waste products from today to be our raw materials for tomorrow. One of the big ones we've got is a company called Plastic Bank, who farm the oceans for plastic. We then
Hmm.
buy that from them. So we support them, we sponsor them, we help pay for it, and then we have dibs on the plastic that they get. So we take that plastic, we clean it, we turn it into plastic chips, and then we reuse it for a lot of the plastic packaging that we have for the beauty care and the other products that we produce. So that gives us quite a good control of our plastic raw material supply chain, because the supply chain issues aren't just in chips, it's in a lot of the other products that companies need as well. Wood, cardboard, plastic, paper, anything really. We've got a lot of stuff that needs to, that is in short supply, and we're all doing our best to do that. As I say, we're quite fortunate because we've got a good control on that, and we use a lot of that type of material, and we use recycled material. The only thing we don't use recycled material for is the raw materials in the actual products. So metals all come from known metal smelters, and we've got very good relationships with those. We don't use any of the rare earth metals in any of our products, and a lot of the chemistries, a lot of the actual resins and active materials we use, we make and develop ourselves. So again, we've got good control over that. But on the whole, we're in a good position, but we know how other people are suffering.
And have you got a distributed supply chain? I mean, or are you focused? Is a lot of your manufacturing and raw materials focused in Asia?
We've got a very much a global footprint. So, ironically, for a number of years now, our Asian or our Chinese plants have looked purely after the Chinese market, and we've got other production facilities around the rest of Asia and the rest of the world, which we use to supply countries locally and globally. So we've been trying to, if you like, reduce our carbon footprint by making sure we've got the production facilities close to the markets that we want them to support. So obviously we've got production facilities in America, Europe, Africa, South America, Asia, Middle East, all over, to try and support the local markets so that we can not only reduce our carbon footprint, but also have quick supply for the materials that we produce. And that's helped us a little bit on the under supply and shipment of products as well. But obviously, some products we will produce in one company and then have to ship around the world, and that is becoming more of a problem.
Right, right. Now, Matt, you wrote a very well received column in EE Times a couple of weeks back. Perhaps, and one of the things you highlighted there, of course, was the fact that this is not just a chip shortage. It really ricochets throughout all parts of the electronic supply chain. Bring us up to date on where we are with from your article.
Well, the semiconductor manufacturers have all committed to massive expansion. So they're talking about expanding fabs in Europe and North America and expanding fabs in Asia as well. So, as is typical, I think we're going to find that moving forward, there's a lot more fab capacity, and there may be more than is needed, but we're also moving towards much more sophisticated chips. So the 3 nanometer node is now being discussed for North America. The 5 nanometer is probably going to be a standard. uh, as time goes on, and then you'll have all of the less complex chips that are still being manufactured that are going to go into much less sophisticated applications. But
Mhm.
at the same time, we do not have the capacity with the assembly and test houses and the printed circuit fabricators and all of the other suppliers that is distributed locally. Or excuse me, that is, yeah, well, distributed locally, because so much of this has been resident in Asia for so long. And now they are realizing that they have to have local supply. Um, as a company like Henkel well knows, you're serving local markets. So you want to have that local presence, you want to have that ability to respond. And that was originally the reason for globalization. Now, everything has been concentrated in China and Southeast Asia. We're realizing that shipping is an issue. We're realizing that time is an issue. We're realizing that communications is still an issue. All of these factors are starting to drive a examination of the supply chain where we can start looking at perhaps reinvigorating manufacturing in the North American market and in Europe.
Right, right. Okay. Um, yeah, I mean, it really is a problem. I mean, I think it needs to come back to regionalisation at least. I mean, I know some people like to use the term reshoring to bring it back to the US, but I think in actual fact, uh, or their own country, but I think it really needs to be a regional approach. We need to have uh, manufacturing and PCBs and OSATs, etc., in Eastern Europe. We need to have the same, perhaps in southern Mexico if we have to satisfy the Americas. Um,
Can
for
I
our
can I
audience,
point out, Trevor, that it's actually going to be worse than that.
Mhm.
With the rapid increase in change in cars from standard internal combustion engines to electric vehicles,
Yeah,
the number of electronic products and therefore the number of chips and the number of components required in those is an exponential growth. So it's not only a case of, there's a shortage now, but as more and more companies change from building standard cars, if you like, to electric vehicles, and that's the same for trucks and vans and everything, this problem's only going to get worse. The number of like sophisticated chips and basic components in all of those vehicles is exponentially more than it is now for standard cars. And that trend is going to be the same for industrial products and lots of other things that are being developed and produced now. So it's
yeah.
not just an issue we've got now, it will be an ongoing issue for quite a long while.
Absolutely, good point. Now, before I move on, I want to just say to our audience that are listening, if you've got any questions or comments that you want to make, please put them in the questions box, and I will be happy to uh, present them to our panel. So don't be shy. Please don't hold back, and let's have some questions. If you've got any questions at all surrounding this supply chain crisis or any aspect of it. Uh, Ed, if I can come to you, I mean,
Sure.
Richard's absolutely right. The industry, even pre-COVID, was growing by application. It was growing exponentially, and we were actually struggling a little bit with the time to market for a lot of these products. I'm sure as a designer, you were under pressure. Are you starting to see that pressure coming back? And do you anticipate in the future it's going to be a problem?
Yeah, very much so. In fact, I was just I want to echo Richard's comment that we have visibility at the system level product development. So a lot of this focus happens to be on electronics and the disruption to the supply chain on the electronics side of the business. But I think we have to pay very close attention to system level assembly and basically integration and I guess a regionalized footprint for supply chain could end up becoming a little bit more problematic in terms of product costs. I mean, in North America, we look at injection molding or plastic housings. The limited capability that we do have here, it's not very competitive in terms of pricing. So we we have to look all across the globe and it presents a huge amount of challenge on your design organization on where to pull and assemble all these products. Now, on the product side, we do see visibility. Uh, for new product development, it's pretty easy to mitigate against that. But where, let's say, we have some very large OEMs that we're doing some flagship products for, and the development has started quite some time ago. It was well into COVID, but I guess the foresight into the current disruption in supply chain, how long it was or how long it potentially could be, has really impacted their thoughts on how to mitigate this, how to best mitigate it. So
Hmm.
we're a big part of that. And that's on the more, let's say, the OEM side, but we also deal, a big part of our business is on the startup side. So we actually look at how are we going to develop products, and as the pressures come in from the supply chain, we have to start pivoting, and it's starting to extend. Frankly, it's extending the time. So there was a huge pressure to try and get product out first. Now it's a lot of our clients are starting to understand that we have to mitigate. So it's really impacting everyone down the chain, from new product development right down to the, like, let's call it the bubblegum refresh and updates.
Right, right. Well, I think one of the other issues, though, in all of this is, of course, the labor shortages, and these labor shortages are across the world. So, I think for the future, for future demand, a lot of it's going to come down to automation. I think you're going to see a lot more automation coming into it. So the labor component is going to be less important. Would you agree,
Absolutely.
Matt?
Yes.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Well,
what are you seeing in
the
terms of
labor,
the
I
labor
think we're
market?
going to have to go. I think we're going to have to go to automation and AI
Mm,
because we just don't have enough labor, and we've got to start looking at alternatives. As an example, Mexico graduates more engineers than most countries every year, and there's a very robust electronics assembly industry down there, but we have to start looking at a lot of other types of manufacturing as well. So whether that can be accomplished, I don't know. But there is a very large workforce, and there's a very well trained workforce in many ways. So we have to start looking at some of these alternatives. Many years ago, Intel went to Costa Rica and put in a assembly plant, and so I'm not sure whether it's still there, but we have to start looking at some of these other areas where there may be labor surpluses. So between automation and between starting to look at alternative manufacturing areas, in Asia, an awful lot of business is already going to Vietnam and to Malaysia and to Thailand.
yeah,
So companies are reducing their China footprint and moving some manufacturing off to some of these other countries. So we have to look at the same thing here because North American labor rates are high and European labor rates are high. So you mentioned Eastern Europe earlier, and these are areas where we may be able to find capacity.
right, right, exactly. Um, okay, so let's move on to the next area. I'm still waiting on some questions coming in from the audience. They've been very quiet today. Uh, what about another aspect of the labor shortages is, of course, people having COVID restrictions. There's people who are being pinged all the time because they're being close to somebody who's been affected. There's also the situation where you've got governments that are subsidizing the workforce while they're on lockdown and that type of thing. How disruptive is that to the industry? Anybody got any comment on that?
Well, it's a mess here in North America because benefits were very generous, and
Mm,
as a result, an awful lot of people have still not re-entered the workforce. And
right.
so this has been more in the service industries and in direct labor. But nevertheless, it has been difficult for a lot of industries to find workers, and we have a severe shortage right now of truck drivers, as an example, which is contributing to the supply chain pain.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that's even exacerbated over here in the UK because, of course, we had Brexit on top of that, which Brexit, as you probably know, was very much around the topic of immigration, and so there's a lot of truck drivers left the market because they couldn't come here anymore. So we're having to reverse that and bring in special visas to try and you know fix the situation. One other thing that came out in the news this week, which I think is interesting, is General Motors made the announcement they're planning to start to go direct to buy their chips and their components. And a lot of the reason they're saying they're going to do this is not just because they're having problems in sourcing these things, and their distributors are having trouble sourcing them, but more because they have a lack of visibility. They need visibility into the supply chain, and therefore they want to start going direct. Now, the knock-on effect of one of these large OEM automakers going direct uh, is, could be significant if others were to follow suit. Uh, I mean, obviously, that's going to start putting pressure on the large component distributors who are also supplying the medium and small manufacturers in the country. Uh, Anybody got any input on that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think there's an issue there as well, because a lot of the automotive companies want their supply handled in a slightly different way than a lot of other companies. They want just in time. They want what they want when they want it. So they're not going to go to a chip supplier and say, we want a week's supply of material at a time, because chip suppliers aren't ramped up to do that. They need to produce en masse and ship en masse to make it viable for them. So there's always going to have to be some sort of buffer in between the chip producer and the end customer, because
Mm,
otherwise we're going to end up with situations where the 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 chip suppliers just can't physically be able to supply the chips in the quantities that people want.
right, right. Well, that's an interesting point, Richard. I mean, one of the things that I heard this week as well is that people are thinking about moving away from the just-in-time uh, business model, which kind of flies in the face of what's been happening with automation recently.
Exactly. I
Uh,
mean, if you're going to automate your production plant, you can't you can't move away from just in time. The whole
right.
process has to work seamlessly. So you need to have the components or the raw materials at the beginning of your production line when you
Mhm,
want them for the number of products that you're making that day or that week. And
mhm,
you're either going to have a massive warehouse next to your production facility that has all of those materials there, and then this ships to you in the quantities you want each day, which then means that these automotive companies are going to be holding a huge amount of stock, and they don't
right.
want to do that. That's not what they're geared up to do. That's just not how they want to work. So I think it's an oxymoron kind of statement to say that the automotive industry will go direct, because their suppliers, the chip producers, the people making even the PCBs, making everything, aren't geared up to supply in the way that the automotive industry wants to receive it. So there has to
Right.
be that distributor in between to act as a buffer.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're
I don't know
right,
what
but I
the other
mean, there
guys
are a
think.
lot of electronic systems coming on the market now where that does give you more visibility, and I think that maybe these big component distributors need to get better with their systems that they're providing to their end customers so that they can give more visibility in that respect. I
Possibly
mean,
get all of the chips shipped through Amazon, as we were talking about earlier, Trevor. Amazon seem to be able to supply
well,
No,
everything
no more power to
instantly,
Amazon.
but
yeah, yeah. He's the Mr. Bezos is the only guy that seems to be able to deliver everything next day or even same day,
Yeah.
which whenever all the rest of us are having huge issues. But then, of course, he's got his own planes, hasn't
I've
he?
got a comment on supply chain, and one of the interesting um, uh, events that happened back in the early 1980s was the migration of the Japanese automotive industry to North America. And they've done a very good job in integrating their systems so that the suppliers are part of the design process, they're part of the fulfillment process. And as a result, that's where a lot of just in time came from. But the big auto manufacturers don't necessarily, in this country, don't necessarily have that. And one of the big issues that I see with the GM proclamation is you can't just buy chips. If you're doing chip on flex, maybe you can, but if you want it in a package, you have to bring in an OSAT. You have to bring in all of the other components to do that as well. And you can't just focus on saying I want to deal directly with TSMC or SMIC or Intel or whoever you're working with.
Yeah.
You have to deal with them and their OSAT and the rest of that supply chain.
Right. Yeah.
And
That's
we
a
need
good
If I
that
point.
could
transparency.
Yeah. No,
sorry, if I could
I think.
interject,
Mhm.
I had some, I do have some experience in the automotive industry. It's where I started my career. And typically, what, 20, 25, 30 years ago, uh, most of the automotive was always tiered. So, like, you got your supply through a tiered supply chain.
Mm.
And uh, yeah, I agree. I agree with the panel that yeah, the entire end assembly point is just in time, but that doesn't imply or doesn't. I mean, I could see the multi-tiered supply chain, building up some form of Kanban just to make the demand or meet the demand. But what I think it will do is, well, aside from impacting the price of the car, because somebody's got to carry that excessive inventory, but it also puts a lot of pressure on the automotive industry to build compelling products so that they could reasonably predict what their demand would be for the year, right?
Yeah. 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 No, that's
So
a good point. Uh, One quick question to you, Ed, before I bring in some questions from the audience. The There was I was on a panel discussion last week, not my own, but somebody else's actually, which I'll be featuring on my Tech Talk Thursday program this week. But one of the comments that was made there was that there seems to be some evidence of OEMs wanting to take back some of the manufacturing in-house and away from the EMS companies. You are right at the beginning of that process. Are you seeing evidence of that?
yeah, actually, we have been exposed to some. It's not an easy endeavor because supply chain is still predominantly in Asia for a lot
Mm.
of their products. So, final. And are you talking final assembly or bringing in, just small aspects of the components?
No, I was talking about final assembly.
Yeah,
Basically
yeah.
bringing most. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's
That's
there's definitely
interesting.
we are very well connected with some consultants for supply chains. I get calls all the time,
Hmm.
and yeah, I think there's an increasing snowball effect for the OEMs wanting to repatriate a lot of their work. But
Right.
as we've pointed out, there is definitely going to be a shortage in labor, and there will be increasing costs. And there's another point that I do want to point out or do want to mention here. We have designed products in the past before for full automated assembly, and that level of thinking or that type of design actually it's not a trivial task. So yeah, you can alleviate some of the pressure via uh, automation, but the industry has to rethink and relearn how to design for automated assembly. And unfortunately, that's just going to be another one of the growing pains that we're going to have to go through. Very few of
Right.
us are left from the old days that we actually did start doing that for quite some time, and then everything was well slated for manual labor for much lower cost regions like in China.
Yeah.
So it's a
Yeah.
very different design philosophy that you have to follow.
Yeah. Well, I think that's
And
going to
Chinese
let's start to
costs
filter
are
through
going
now.
up. So
Yeah,
China is experiencing its own wage inflation now, and
absolutely.
we're seeing that affect the Chinese manufacturing companies as well.
Right, right. Okay.
I
A
think you've
couple of
also got to
questions.
look at the effect of someone like Tesla on the automotive market, where Tesla didn't exist a few years ago, and suddenly they're one of the biggest suppliers of cars in the world, or certainly one of the biggest companies in the world. And the OEMs are looking at that and thinking, "Hey, how did that happen? How do we not? How were we behind the ball on this? Why did we not have these electric cars? Why didn't we do this?" And I think they realize they need to bring a lot of the technology and the intellectual property in-house to
Hmm.
be able to compete against the likes of Tesla and the likes of these electronic or the electric car companies that are starting up that
Yeah,
control all of their production, know all of the stuff that they're doing. And the OEMs have relied so long on third-party designs and and companies to build the parts for their car, whereas Tesla are designing everything and doing everything in-house.
right,
Well,
right.
if I could
Okay,
interject,
great.
one
Mhm.
Tesla is perceived. So what, Richard? That's an excellent point. And we've looked at this countless times over the last 3 to 5 years, and we had one big client. Uh, so their mantra was to being. They wanted to be perceived as a tech company. Tesla is perceived as a technology company, whereas the automotive companies here in North America, at least, um, Bill Ford just announced, or sorry, Ford Motor Company just announced today that they're going to open up two more facilities in the U.S. for electric vehicles. And you know, Bill Ford himself said there's nothing revolutionary that has come out. It's all evolutionary. So I think there's a huge paradigm that's going to be a paradigm shift that's going to happen in the North American automotive industry, where you're going to see a lot of these companies trying to bring the IP back in and expand on it, bring innovation right back into their core.
Right, right. Yeah, but I mean, the one thing though for these North American, in fact, even European car companies, is that these legacy companies is that the manufacturing electric vehicles is a very different uh, te- you know set of skills than building combustion engines. So there's an awful lot of retraining and to be done for these companies to make that change. I want to jump to a question from our audience. I'll start off with this one for Richard from Jeremy Pierce. Are these issues likely to delay 5G and climate change technology? Is there any evidence of that? Obviously, he's
It,
referring to the supply chain.
yeah, it might actually push it the other way. I think, if you've got supply chains, if you've got raw material issues, it
Mhm.
causes companies to re-evaluate and re-look at what they're doing and how they're doing it. And that then gives them the chance to actually improve and become more sustainable. That's certainly what we've been doing for the last 10, 15 years. We've always been a very sustainable company. We've always looked at, we've been measuring the water quality in the Rhine since the 1950s to see if any of our detergents are getting in there. But from the electronic side, we've also been looking at sustainable productions, that circular economy. And I think more and more companies, because of the lack of supply of the raw materials, because of the difficulty in getting the materials they want, they're going to have to look at different routes, different ways of doing it. And that is going to cause more and more people to be able to get materials in a more sustainable way. Because if you're going to look at it from a different direction, why not be more sustainable? Because then that ticks the box that you need to be more sustainable anyway. So I think it's actually going to improve it, if anything else.
Right, right. Okay, interesting. A question for you, Ed. How specific are these issues around component types? Are some sectors likely to be more affected than others? Are there any specific real component types that when you're designing boards that you typically would avoid?
Yeah, that's a great question. We operate in many verticals. So we do high-end audio, we do medical wellness devices. Everywhere, everything is impacted. stuff like
Mhm.
relays for repairs on one of the health and wellness devices. Like we just simply couldn't find any. So we had several devices that we needed to support our clients to repair. It goes everywhere, and it's unfortunately it's not predictable at this point. Once the design starts to harden, and as we typically operate where we try and get clear visibility very early on. This is just the way we operate, through years of refining our development process. So we try to get visibility on end of life components, which was a big issue back in those days, but now it's availability, simply availability. So typically, once we get down and we start reaching out to the manufacturing network and we release the bill of materials, then they come back, and then we got to look, okay, geez, how do we mitigate this? And the worst problem is that at system level, very often it's not just a straight swap. You're lucky if it is, but typically it's not. Then you have to rethink the architecture, and then you have to understand the repercussions or that cascading effect that happens at the product level. How much do you have to redevelop your firmware? Do you have to do any major changes to that? Then the software as it goes down. So it's a very difficult question to answer, and it just keeps popping its ugly head up at almost every corner that we encounter.
Right, right. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move on to the elephant in the room, should I say, or one of them. I'll give this one to you, Matt. How
Thanks.
concerned should we be about geopolitical risks, specifically around Taiwan?
Well,
Wow.
I think we have to be very concerned. I mean, you've seen the military response where the British fleet is now in the South China Sea. The Japanese are now rearming. People are taking it very seriously because China is very serious.
Mm,
They want Taiwan back, and this has been a goal ever since 1949. And now with the military that they've been building, they feel that they are the big kids on the block, and they are using hard power. So
mm,
between their use of soft and hard power, they've been very good at what they've done around the
mhm,
world. But they've been using soft and hard power, and this is seen in the Belt and Road. This is seen in their expansion in the South China Sea and with their fractious relationships with their neighbors. So I don't think it's going away. I think it's going to get worse.
yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and is there really anything that the United States and its allies could do about it? Because at the end of the day, Taiwan's only about 100 miles off the coast of mainland China. I mean, if it happens, it's going to be all over and done by, before anybody can do anything about it.
Well, the other answer is oil. China
Right.
is an importer of raw materials
Mhm.
um, of hydrocarbons, and
Mm,
so right now they've got a shortage. They've got an 18-day inventory of coal in their power plants. They're cutting
mhm,
back manufacturing. They're cutting back power by several hours a day in a lot of their cities. So they are riding on a knife edge because the not only the South China Sea is a major transit point, but so are the Straits of Malacca. So is the Straits of Hormuz. There are many
mhm.
choke points on the way to China, and the conflict is it's all sort of behind the scenes, and it's this is all on the with the strategists at much higher pay grade than I am, but it is becoming more fractious. So I think
Yeah.
we have to look at that very carefully.
What about the recent vacuum left in Afghanistan? I mean, they seem to be moving in there, and Afghanistan has got a lot of rare earth metals itself, but it's also got the second biggest copper mine in the world. Is that right,
Well, you got
Richard?
yeah,
The
yeah,
second
you
biggest
have to
copper mine.
remember that you need the infrastructure to get that out. And
Hmm.
Afghanistan has no infrastructure. So it's going to take years upon years for that to come online, if it ever does,
Hmm.
because Afghanistan has its own internal dynamic of tribalism. And so people are talking about huge rare earth deposits. I'm not sure about the copper mining, but I do know rare earths fairly well. But right now, the rare earth market that we have is the one that we have to go with.
Mhm.
So this is something that I think is going to take time, but the real impact has been geopolitical, and I hate to say it, has been very negative for the United States.
Mm.
Right, right. Okay. Any more comments from either from our panelists or from our audience? If you've got any questions, please let me know. But this is definitely a hot topic.
I have one, if you don't
Yep,
mind, Trevor.
of course.
And it's for you, Matt. Just out of curiosity, how long do you think it would take to, let's say, reestablish similar, let's say, a technology supply chain in the U.S. or somewhere else other than Taiwan, if the decision, like, if there was any, let's say, strife to happen there? I mean, it would obviously be very disruptive for the world, but
It would be, I would suggest holding onto your car and your iPhone.
Yeah.
Because those are going to get directly impacted. Already, there's thousands of cars sitting in yards all over the country and all over Europe waiting for components. But
yeah.
if we seriously want to reestablish a supply chain, it's going to take 1 to 3 years. We don't make a lot of product in North America anymore. An awful lot of it is made in China, and
Hmm.
we would need fiberglass treaters. We would need photoresist manufacturing, which is fairly straightforward and could be done. But then you'd also need to have all of the OSAT capacity. You have the semiconductor people spending $100 billion on new fabs in North America. That's all going to take some time.
Hmm.
Mm,
So I think we have to be realistic about this and realize that we're sort of joined at the hip with China as well. So
yeah,
it's not in their interest, it's not in our interest to have
yeah,
any real conflict.
yeah,
So I hope
yeah. It's not
cooler heads
absolutely not.
prevail.
Yeah, I mean, I hope sense does prevail because I mean, Taiwan is not only home to, of course, TSMC, which is the by far the world's biggest chip fabricator, but it's also the headquarters of the five largest contract manufacturers in the world. Uh,
Hmm.
so it's strategically it's critical. So
And
let's
and
hope sense.
strategically and
Yeah.
strategically those companies' manufacturing operations, an awful lot of it is in China.
Mhm. That's true. That's true. That is true. Well, let's hope, as I say, that good sense prevails. But I think this has been certainly a worthwhile discussion today. We don't often talk about these things because they are a bit political. But you know, we've got a lot of challenges. I mean, just final question: how long do you think it'll be before we can start to see some normalcy coming back into the market, and what needs to happen to make that happen? Let's start with you, Richard.
Well, some of the lead times we've heard from customers, and when we use components ourselves to test products and stuff, and some of the lead times we've had have been 12 to 18 months. So you've got to look at that and think it's going to be a long while before it comes back to normal. But a year, I would say, maybe a little bit more than a year, but around about a year before things start trickling back to normal. I would say hopefully this time next year we should all be at least seeing the end of the tunnel if we're not already in a much better point
Right.
along the tunnel.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
very much on message with Elon Musk there. He seems to think about a year, and we're going to be starting to work through it. Ed, any comment?
Well, we were hoping about 4 months ago, the forecast was a little bit more sanity being placed back in around Q1, so around the January February timeframe. But that's completely gone. A lot of our clients are on their critical components. They're seeing 52-week lead times. With
Wow.
quite often there's no guarantee of products. So I'm in agreement with Richard where I think I personally believe that this disruption, assuming everything, yeah, I'd say about 18 months
Hmm.
definitely.
Hmm. And you know, to be able to try and get us through it, I mean, what needs to happen? I mean, do we need to try and open up at least some air corridors for safe travel to countries that have got a higher percentage vaccination, so that at least we can start getting components and lighter parts going back and forward in the bellies of these aircraft? That would help to ease things up quite considerably.
Well, that, and also looking at Ed and the work he does, is looking at materials that are designed to be recycled and reused. So the more bits of a car you can take off and reuse in the next generation of cars, the easier it will be to have quicker turnaround of products and quicker development. I think, we unfortunately we've only got the one planet, and at the moment we're working on using more raw materials and more stuff than the one planet can produce. So we need to. I'm sounding a little bit environmental here, but we need to look at being able to reuse material that we've already got, not just rely on getting fresh material all of the time. So I think designing products to be reused or being recycled will certainly, in the very, very long term, help to reduce the demand that we have for new products being produced and the demand for product to be shipped around the world.
Right. Okay. Final word to you, Matt.
Well, I'm concerned about a few things. Number one, energy, because you've got an energy crisis in Europe right now. You've got an energy crisis in China. So, is it going to be a cold winter? And that's something I think we have to look at, because that can also impact what people are buying. And in the end, it's the consumer who controls an awful lot of this. But at the same time, there are very strong inflationary pressures around the world, and we have to look at that. We're seeing equipment costs rising 20% out of Asia right now for manufacturing equipment. So these are being passed along to customers and to end users. So the transportation costs are higher, the manufacturing costs are higher. This is all leading to an inflationary environment. So those are two of the big concerns right now.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with you. And I think inflation is going to be an obvious byproduct of this. We're
And
already seeing
and
prices going up.
with inflation, it helps solve itself, because demand will reduce for many products, and then prices will come down. But we're going to have to go through a lot of pain to get there.
Yeah, yeah, great. Well, gentlemen, I think we've had a great debate today. It's a really hot topic at the moment, and let's hope we start to see some clarity over the next few months as we go forward. But right now, I want to thank you for joining us, Richard Boyle from Henkel, Ed Bexey from Pegmatis, and of course, Matt Holtzman from CGI Americas. And thank you for watching us today.
Global SMT and Packaging opens